This is the untold story of the making of the modern world. We follow the flow of civilization from the Middle East, an extraordinary place that is home to the founding cultures of history, a vital link between the continents of Asia, Africa, and Europe. An economic, scientific, and cultural birthplace of the world. A fresh perspective, charting the spread of civilization across the globe, from the dawn of mankind and the first cities and empires to the belief in one God. It will be an epic journey of discovery, where East meets West. Mecca, the holiest city in the Islamic world. This is the city where the Prophet Muhammad was born, around the year 570. The city where he first received God's message. The city which gave birth to Islam. For over 1,400 years, no non-Muslim has been allowed to enter Mecca. While it's been the duty of every able-bodied follower to pilgrimage here and pay homage to God once in their lifetime, performing the Hajj, one of the 5 pillars of Islam. In the last month of the Islamic calendar, over 3 million Muslims still perform this pilgrimage each year, worshiping around the Kaaba, the black stone which marks the Muslim direction of prayer. In the 21st century, Islam is the fastest growing religion on earth. Over 1.5 billion people, 23% of the world's population, following the words of the Prophet Muhammad. This is the story of the events that began this amazing global following. Exploring the cultural heritage of its first converts, the nomadic Arab tribes who before Islam had conquered the desert, but had yet to change the wider world. Under Islam, they were united under one banner, transforming not just the Middle East, but the rest of the globe forever. Every year during the Hajj, pilgrims make an extra journey to the outskirts of Mecca to climb Mount Nur, following in the footsteps of their Prophet Muhammad.
عندما جاء النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم عمره في 40 سنة في رمضان 27 ليلة القدر. هذا المكان مرتفع ويشوف مكة من فوق من ذروة قمة. بسبب هذا هو كان يشوف أحوال المجتمع ويفكر فيه ويعبد الله سبحانه وتعالى وبهذا الشكل حتى وصل إلى 40 سنة.
For the first 40 years of his life, the Prophet Muhammad, then a merchant citizen of Mecca, made the journey here to reflect and escape, disenchanted by the sinful lifestyle of the urban populace below. And it was here, 1,400 years ago, that his piety was rewarded when God first revealed his message to him, an event that would change the world forever.
هذا غار هيرا. الرسول صلى الله عليه وسلم كان يتعبد هنا. نزل الوحي، نزل جبريل ونزل مع وحي.
As he rested on the top of the mountain, the angel Gabriel appeared to him 3 times, instructing the prophet to recite the following.
اقرأ باسم ربك الذي خلق خلق الإنسان من علق اقرأ وربك الأكرم الذي علم بالقلم علم الإنسان ما لم يعلم كلا
With this revelation, the call to Islam had begun. The first of many which the Prophet Muhammad would receive throughout his life. Revelations that would become the basis of the holiest book of Islam, the Quran. It was following this revelation that the Prophet Muhammad began his mission to spread the word of Islam, sowing the seeds that would bring the Arab tribes together under one banner for the first time ever. This incident is one of the most momentous in the history of world religion, an event that would permanently transform the cultural makeup of the Arabian Peninsula. But what do we know of the origins of the Arabic peoples? And how did they grow to dominate the region? Long before Islam, Arabic tribes and settlements populated the area. Ancient texts give us a tantalizing glimpse into their early history.
The first time the Arabs appear in any sort of historical record is in the victory inscriptions of the Assyrian kings. The Assyrian kings are the great warrior kings of northern Iraq from about 1000 BC onwards. And the great thing about the Assyrians was that they put up monuments and they wrote about what they'd been doing in this cuneiform writing that we see here. And in this one, Shalmaneser III, in about 850 BC, is writing about his conquests, and he's writing about his allies and the people who fought with him, and one of these is called Gindibu the Arab, named as such, with 1,000 of his followers. We don't know anything more than that about them, but this is the first time the name Arab appears in the historical record.
Around 100 years later, the first visual images of Arabs appear. A frieze dating from 728 BC depicts a triumphant procession of prisoners.
Here are the Arab prisoners, definitely prisoners. They've only got little sort of skirts on. They've been stripped of their clothes. They're bearded, they've got long hair. All these things are probably accurate. And look at the way they've got their wrists tied behind their backs. These people are not having a good time. And here, on the lower reference, we see the sort of things that the Assyrians were taking from these Arabs. And the first thing are the camels. The classic one-humped camels of the desert that you still see today. And this is the chief sort of booty that the Arabs have to offer.
And even today, nomadic Bedouin tribes still inhabit the desert, living a remarkably similar lifestyle to their ancient Arab forefathers.
هم البدو لأن الإنسان مثل ما عاش من أول إحنا عشنا في الصحراء وهيك عايشين نفس طبيعة آبائنا وأجدادنا عندنا نفسيتنا نفس نفسيتهم لنا أعتز فيها وأفتخر بها هذه العيشة وما في يعني ما تخاف لأنك تحافظ على كرامتك وعلى عيشتك وعلى أرضك وعلى عرضك في حياة البدو.
Although it wasn't until the birth of Islam that the Arab tribes began to establish a unified culture and make a global impact, this tribal way of life, traveling in small nomadic groups, bonded by tribal laws and loyalties, had enabled them not only to survive, but to flourish on the limited resources which the desert offered.
The desert looks to us to be incredibly harsh and inhospitable, but properly managed by people who knew what they were doing, it could be a land of opportunity. Caravans could be organized to go through the desert, passing from one tribal territory to another, and to bring profit to the people who organize them.
Desert trade and way of life had given rise to one of the most remarkable cities of the ancient world, on the edge of the Arabian desert, Petra. A city famous in history and myth, rich in culture and capital, but whose beginnings were more humble.
What makes Petra unique is that it combines two seemingly paradoxical characteristics. It's both hidden, ringed by this huge range of mountains that you see around you, and it's also very accessible. When you pass out to the east, one enters a narrow passage that takes you then to a junction of trade routes through which one can access markets to the north, Syria and beyond, to the east, Iraq and Iran, to the south, Yemen, and also to the west through a gap in the mountains here onto Gaza and the Mediterranean. The Nabateans, an Arab people who pastured herds of sheep and camels in the eastern deserts here, gradually took control of these trade routes.
The first records of the Nabateans date from over 2,300 years ago. While they were still a nomadic tribe, they established Petra as a city for their dead, carving out over 800 tombs from the rocky ravines. But within 200 years, their fortunes would change as they accumulated vast wealth from their monopoly of the lucrative trade routes.
The Nabateans became wealthy in particular because of one product, namely incense. Frankincense is only found in Yemen. By the time the frankincense gets to the markets of the Mediterranean, you have to pay a fortune. It's 6 gold coins for each pound of frankincense. A gold coin is something that an average person couldn't dream of earning in a whole year. The Nabateans cream off a lot of the money from this.
With the revenue, the Nabateans transformed Petra from a city of the dead into a living, bustling metropolis. They created a cosmopolitan society, drawing on the many cultures they encountered through trade.
In many ways, this is the uniqueness of Petra, bringing together of different traditions and ideas from so many peoples.
They were the first Arabs to establish a kingdom. But while their nomadic culture had enabled them to conquer the desert, they would never conquer the wider world. "1,900 years ago, the Roman Empire spread east and gained control of the region. The Nabateans' kingdom was eventually annexed around the year 100, and when the Romans redirected the trade routes away from Petra, their glory days were over. It would be another 300 years before the Arabs' fortunes would begin to change forever. And they changed because of the birth of Islam and the drive of the Prophet Muhammad and his successors to spread the new religion.
Her ne kadar Kur'an Arap diliyle gelmiş, inmiş ise de ama bu Araplara mahsus bir şey değildi. Bütün insanlığa ulaştırılması gerekiyordu. Böyle olduğu için her Müslüman kendini bununla sorumlu hissetti ve İslamiyet'i başkalarına anlatabilmek, bu Tanrı'nın mesajını başkalarına ulaştırabilmek için her yolu denemeye çalıştılar.
It was this that would help fuel the early expansion of the Muslim empire. Just 2 years after the death of the Prophet Muhammad, this desire resulted in the Arab Muslims' first major victory, the taking of Damascus. The manner in which they won over both the city and its citizens would set the style for Islam's spread over the next 100 years. Damascus is said to be the oldest continuously occupied city in the world. Before the current civil war plunged Syria into chaos, the busy souk at Damascus reflected its origins as a thriving center of commerce, the terminus of trade with Mecca, linking the Far East with the Christian Byzantine West. Damascus was the emporium, the rich city in the minds of the Arabs, and conquering it was a symbolic act. In 634, the Muslim army arrived at the city's gates. But their generals were split on how to take the city, either by the sword or through negotiation. The military approach was personified by Khalid ibn al-Walid, a warrior whose fearsome reputation in battle had already gained him the title, the Sword of Islam. He began to lay siege to the Eastern Gate.
And Khalid ibn al-Walid is a man of action, is really the very famous hero of the Islamic armies in the early years of the conquest. And he and his division were here at the eastern gate of the city of Damascus.
But while Khalid ibn al-Walid was spoiling for a fight at the eastern gate of the city, at the opposite gate, his fellow general, Abu Ubaidah al-Jarrah, had different plans.
Abu Ubaidah al-Jarrah entered into negotiations on the other end, probably with the Patriarch of Damascus, and ultimately signed a treaty or a truce whereby the army was let into the city peacefully from the western gate of the city. And the story goes that half of Damascus was conquered by war and the other half was conquered by peace.
The ancient city that had been under the dominion of the most powerful force in the West, the Byzantines, was now ruled from the east by the east. The old order was gone, and the balance of power had shifted. Damascus had become home to a new form of government that would change the world. Remarkably, although spreading Islam was a prime motivation for territorial growth, the new Islamic rulers didn't simply impose their beliefs on the city's inhabitants, most of whom were Christians. There's evidence for this in the history of one of the city's oldest religious buildings.
نحن على هذه القطعة من الأرض كان هناك السوق الذي يحيط في المعبد اللي هو المعبد المقدس، وداخل المعبد كان هناك قدس الأقداس أو السلة أو المذبح. هذا الجدار الذي يمثل والذي نراه هنا يمثل جدار التيمينوس، جدار المعبد الروماني اليوناني الأصلي. لم يتغير هذا الجدار، ومحيط هذا الجدار أيضا لم يتغير، وإنما تغير استعماله من معبد روماني إلى كنيسة بيزنطية.
But when the Muslims conquered the city in the 7th century, they didn't take over the church immediately and build the great mosque we see today. For many decades after the conquest, it remained a church too. Amazingly, the Muslims decided to share it with the Christians.
فكان الجامعة في الجهة الشرقية، وكان الكنيسة في الجهة الغربية، وكان المواطنون الدمشقيون يدخلون من البوابة الجنوبية، يذهب إلى المسلمون إلى جامعهم والمسيحيون إلى هذه الكنيسة، وبقي الحال على ذلك حوالي 70 عام.
Religious and cultural tolerance, as well as military strength, had characterized the Arab-Muslim conquest of Damascus, and it would continue to do so as they maintained their expansion. As the 7th century continued, the Arab-Muslim forces became increasingly powerful. After Damascus had fallen, they set their sights on another city of major importance in the region. It was a place of little strategic value, but of huge religious significance for every faith group in the region, including the new Islamic State, Jerusalem. According to Islamic tradition, this is where the Prophet Muhammad was taken on the night journey by the angel Gabriel, where he led the other prophets in prayer and met with God. Jerusalem was the Muslims' third holiest city after Mecca and Medina.
The night journey in itself is important in Muslim practice and belief, because at that night, Prophet Muhammad, according to Muslim point of views, performed a prayer. He was the Imam, the leader of all the prominent prophets like Isaac, Abraham, Jesus, Moses.
But at the beginning of the 7th century, Jerusalem, like Damascus, was ruled by the Byzantines. As Christians, they considered it to be their holiest of cities, at its sacred heart, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre.
We are in front of the Holy Sepulchre, and according to Christianity, Jesus Christ was crucified and buried here, inside here, in the middle of Jerusalem.
Just 3 years after the fall of Damascus, in 637, the Arab Muslim forces arrived at the city's walls. And as the Byzantine forces had already been routed from Damascus, Jerusalem couldn't rely on any military backup. Although Jerusalem held out for 4 months, its ruler, the Patriarch Sophronius, knew that his city's fate was sealed and decided to surrender. Sophronius had taken a huge gamble. What would happen to the Christians' most important city once it was claimed by a force that also held it so sacred?
Umar ibn al-Khattab came to the Holy Sepulchre because the Patriarch wanted to show him the church. Then it was the time for Muslim prayer, and he wanted to pray, so the Patriarch asked him to pray inside the church, and he refused. He refused because he told him that in the future, the Muslims will start saying that Umar ibn al-Khattab prayed here, and then they will claim the place and they will change the church to mosque.
Recognizing the importance of the church to Christians, the Muslim spiritual and political leader, the Caliph Omar, decided to find another location to pray, finding his own place of worship within just a few yards of the Holy Sepulchre, establishing the mosque that today bears his name. The Muslims were now in possession of one of their holiest cities, and they could set about celebrating the location where the Prophet Muhammad was taken on the night journey, today marked by the oldest surviving Islamic monument in the world, the Dome of the Rock.
When ordinary Muslim visit the Dome of the Rock, the first act they will do a prayer following the steps of Prophet Muhammad. So that really is so important in Islamic creed and Islamic belief.
After the conquest of Jerusalem, the Christians were again allowed to keep their churches, and the Jews, who under the Romans and Byzantines had been banished from the city for centuries, were now allowed to return. Shortly after Jerusalem fell, the Arab forces made another major conquest. And like the development of every empire in history, the direction of expansion was very much motivated by the potential riches on offer. Nowhere in the world offering greater rewards than Egypt, the breadbasket of the region. In 639, the Arab Muslim forces arrived in the country. The speed of their advance was amazing. They quickly gained control of the Nile, overcoming its heavily guarded defenses, before advancing on its capital, Alexandria. This was the port, which had been the main hub between East and West for over 1,000 years. Within 2 years, Egypt was completely under Arab Muslim control. The Byzantines banished from the region forever. The Islamic State now set out to maximize the riches it could gain from the country. One of the first buildings they made wasn't dedicated to religion. It was designed to calculate tax and therefore fund their empire.
This is the Nilometer, and this is probably the oldest Islamic building in Egypt. The Nilometer is the device that measures the water of the Nile. Every year the Nile used to flood. The water would come in from this hole there, and the space that we're standing in would be filled up. And the column has all these measurements. The unit of these measurements is the cubit. So every cubit, you can see there's a section there, and people would be recording this all the time. And this has to be monitored every day because it should always be compared with the year before and the years before. If it gives you good Niles, good level, then everything will be okay. You'll have good irrigation, you'll have good crops, you'll sell well, you'll do good business. People will pay taxes, no problems.
By monitoring the levels of the Nile, the Islamic State could evaluate each year's potential harvest and therefore how much they could tax the population, maximizing their financial rewards. Because this wasn't a smash and grab raid, the Islamic State wanted to create a lasting empire and make sure that Egypt would become the jewel in that empire's crown forever. The Arab Muslim army, who were still mostly nomadic tribesmen, now had to settle down to make sure their presence was permanent. And a few hundred yards from the site of their first victory, archaeologists have discovered evidence of the Muslims' very first settlement in Egypt.
These brick buildings are the remains of the houses of the earliest Islamic settlement in this area called Fustat. This was originally the site where the Arab army was based. One of the first things that was done was the foundation of the new congregational mosque. This was the key place for the bonding and the communal interaction of this new religious community. The rest of the city was laid out by means of plots of land which were given to the different tribal units. Basically, the whole of Fustat is a new settlement. It didn't take over any pre-existing settlements. There was nothing here before, and that's a very unusual development in the history of urbanism.
The Arab Muslim forces had built a totally new capital completely from scratch. And what started off as a small settlement, Fustat, would eventually become part of Cairo, today the biggest Arab city in the world. The city of 1,000 minarets, with a predominantly Muslim population of around 15 million people. As the Muslims' territories grew, new distinctly Arab Islamic towns began to evolve. Baghdad, Basra, Mosul, Fustat, and Kairouan, reshaping the landscape of Arabia and North Africa completely. Even today, the layout of towns like Fez in Morocco still reflect the character and culture of its early nomadic settlers.
Fez captures the very essence of what is an Islamic city. When the city was first built, it was organized into a number of neighborhoods, and usually there are a number of things or a number of reasons behind this organization. I would think tribal, ethnic, or even religious affiliations. Each neighborhood is self-sufficient in terms of all its basic needs. For example, there is a fountain, usually used for the population of the neighborhood to fetch their water. It would have a mosque, a kutab, which is basically a place for learning for children, to teach them the very basic of religion. A number of shops. Usually each neighborhood would have an oven for baking the bread of the neighborhood.
Each town would also have their own specific business and trade networks. At the Chuara tanneries in Fez, animal hides are still stripped, tanned, and dyed and transformed into products in the traditional manner. It's a relic of a network of trade that dates back 1,000 years, which promoted prosperity as well as the exchange of ideas. These structured neighborhood units were the core of the new cities, which sprang up across the Islamic Empire. The labyrinthine maze of streets that linked them together was quite different from the open, gridded city planning of the classical world that had gone before. By the early 8th century, the empire now covered the whole of the Middle East and North Africa, and it was about to spread even further west. Just 8 miles off the coast of Morocco, across the Straits of Gibraltar, lay a whole new frontier for the Islamic army: Spain. Like Egypt before, Spain's fertile lands offered a new opportunity to amass wealth for the Islamic Empire. And it was in a state of political turmoil. In fact, it was ripe for the picking.
Spain at this stage was suffering what seems to have been a short-term political crisis, but a political crisis nonetheless. And the King Wititza had died, and there was a struggle for succession. And this seems to have been one of the reasons why Spain performed so badly when faced with what was probably a much smaller number of Muslim troops.
In 711, the Muslim army conquered southern Spain and set up their governorate capital at Cordoba in their new province, Al-Andalus. They now set about stamping their identity on the west, building an imperial mosque as magnificent as any they'd created in the east. The walls of the magnificent edifice covered with glittering mosaics, taking their inspiration from designs originating in the Great Mosque in Damascus. The effect of this Islamic monument on the Spanish population was so profound that even when Christianity returned to dominate most of Spain 500 years later, the new Christian rulers chose not to destroy the Islamic presence completely, but instead built their cathedral right in the heart of the mosque.
Instead of demolishing the mosque, the cathedral was established in the middle of the mosque. The people of Cordoba didn't want the mosque to disappear because they considered the mosque the symbol, the emblem of Cordoba. And that's how the representation of Islam became, in fact, the representation of the people of Cordoba and of Andalusia.
As evident in these buildings, the mosques at Damascus, Jerusalem, and Cordoba, Islam and its culture spread widely through the 7th and 8th centuries across the Asian continent and beyond. But culture and architecture weren't the only footprint the religion made. There was another gift Islam gave to the world, a spirit of early discovery and scientific learning, the results of which changed our world forever. It was a wave of discovery inspired by the religion itself. Faith in the Word of God.
There are many passages in the Quran, for example, that tell you to look around at the world and marvel at it, but also come to understand it better, because the world is full of signs that it has been made by a wise and just and merciful creator. So Muslim scientists in this medieval period thought of science as a way of studying the work of God in the world.
And this desire to study the Word of God in a scientific way inspired a flurry of investigation and inquiry that traversed the globe and carried civilization forward. And its center was a magnificent city on the banks of the Tigris. In 750, the mighty Abbas...
It's a sort of a pattern that kept repeating with all these new small kingdoms or principalities or new empires where rulers and sovereigns and even rich people and big generals would build mosques, madrasas, and in order to allow for teaching, and they would host and sponsor scholars to come and teach in their schools.
Across the Muslim world, madrasas and universities sprang up to rival Al-Azhar. In Fez, Morocco, the Qarawiyyin University was the first, and it gave birth to a whole university town with smaller institutions of learning, many of them architectural wonders, like the Bu Hananiya Madrasa. The madrasa's every surface bears witness to the intellectual sophistication of those times.
أنا مجلس العلم فأحلل به تكون كيف شئت ابدأ عالمة وانظمها وألهنها وحصنها وحرزها وثبت وأوفى فضلا وعمر نداين حتى كملت القصيدة على طول عرض المدرسة كانت ودخل بها حتى المسجد لداخل وجاء آخر ديالها هو هذا.
The Buhinania Madrasa housed and fed students for free until as recently as the 1960s. It was part of an enduring and international culture of scholarship. The Islamic world in the Middle Ages represented a massive free trade zone in which scholars at the courts of different rulers and the universities they founded could exchange and review each other's ideas, with spectacular results. The philosophers and scholars of the Muslim world were pioneers of an idea that still shapes the modern world. That the universe can be understood through reason, without harm to religion. The discovery of this knowledge kick-started Europe's emergence from its dark age and formed the basis of the revolution we call the Renaissance.